Okay, so I hope that you can see my presentation now. My title is Drug Misuse in the UK, Current Trends and Future Risks. And what I want to do in this talk is to talk about drug use, why it's important, how common it is, and what some of the key issues are for drug policy currently in this country. So first of all, I'm calling this drug misuse, but maybe that's not the right term. Misuse implies some degree of judgment, and I'm not trying to do that. Some people would call this recreational drug use, but that's not, maybe recreational is not quite the right term. Some people aren't actually doing this for fun. They're doing this because they have to. We could talk about illegal drug use, but not all drugs that might be used in this way are illegal. So there are difficulties with terminology. I'm going to stick with misuse because that's the government approved term, but you may have views about better terms. There's a question about whether it matters. Well, I'm going to try and persuade you that drug misuse does matter. There are some reasons why we should be concerned about it. It's a matter of opinion about whether it should be illegal or a matter of personal choice. And in that respect, your views are just as valid as mine, but it's always useful to form views in the light of accurate information. There's that old chestnut, of course, that while many drugs may be illegal to use, it's perfectly legal to use alcohol and tobacco and some other psychoactive substances, and we could discuss that. And then, is this a criminal justice issue as it's largely perceived in Great Britain, or is it more a health or an educational issue? And we can debate that too. So the first bit of information I want to give you is how we think about drugs legally in the UK. We classify drugs into three broad categories: Class A, Class B, and Class C. Those categories of where drugs go depends on how harmful they're perceived to be. Not just harmful in health terms, but also their harms in societal terms. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later on. The most harmful drugs are in Class A. They're drugs like heroin and cocaine. And the least harmful but still controlled drugs or illegal drugs are in Class C. Drugs like diazepam and gamma hydroxybutyrate and tramadol. And then there's drugs considered to be in the middle range, like cannabis and ketamine. They're Class B. So I'm going to be using these terms a little bit during this talk, which is why I thought I should define them. Now, there are penalties to possessing or supplying drugs. So having drugs on you carries penalties, and the size of those penalties depends on which class those drugs are in. And supply or production, so this might be making the drug or selling it or even giving it to somebody else. That would be counted as supply. And there are also penalties for that. And the penalties in Class A are higher than the penalties in Class B or Class C. So I've defined the legal situation for you. Some of these illegal drugs are used medically, and there's a little hashtag against those. There are many examples of medically used drugs which are illegal to possess and supply for other reasons. So how many people use these drugs? Well, there's a survey done every year as part of the crime survey for England and Wales, which asks a large number of people about criminal justice things. And one of the questions they ask is about drug use. And you can see here from this table that if we look at people in the age group of 16 to 59, just under 10% of them have used an illegal drug in the last year. And if we look in the last month, it's about 5%. And if we look across a lifetime, it's about a third. If we look at younger people between 16 and 24 years of age, those numbers are considerably higher. Around 1 in 5 young people aged between 16 and 24 is used an illegal drug. That's about 1.3 million young people. And in the last month, it's more than 10%, or about 730,000 young people have used an illegal drug in the last month. And if we look at Class A, the most harmful, those numbers are smaller, but they're still quite big numbers. 1.3 million people used a Class A drug in the last year, and 600,000 young people used a Class A drug in the last year. So this is quite big business. So I'm going to come up to my first poll question, and this is where I want to cue you, Laura. These are the questions I'm going to ask, and they're coming up in the poll in front of you. If you just like to click in England and Wales, which of the following drugs do you think is most commonly used by young people? That's people aged 16 to 24 years. So we'll just wait a few moments for you to click one answer for this question. Okay, and 75% of you think that the most common drug is cannabis. And then we've got ecstasy, cocaine, heroin, in fact, nitrous oxide, and then heroin, which is very impressive, actually. So let me move on to the next slide and show you drug use in the last year. And as 3/4 of you said, the most common drug to be used is cannabis. The second most, sorry, I've skipped on for some reason. The second most common drug, actually in younger people, is nitrous oxide, which is inhaled from balloons. Nitrous oxide, as you may know, is used to make whipped cream, and you can inhale it and get an effect, and that is quite popular. I'm not going to say much more about that, and I certainly wouldn't encourage you to do it. For young people, cocaine is third, and then ecstasy, then ketamine. I'm not going to say much about ketamine during this talk, but I would just like to take the opportunity to point out that ketamine used regularly has serious long-term health effects. It damages and scars the bladder, and that causes long-term and largely untreatable urinary symptoms, which are unpleasant. So it's one to avoid in particular. And then after that, we've got amphetamines, new psychoactive substances, mushrooms, LSD, much less common, and heroin use actually across the whole population extremely uncommon, particularly in the younger age group. If we think about trends in drug use over the last 30 years or so, or 25 years, you can see here on that top line that amongst younger people, in fact, drug misuse has declined, and the cohort of university and late school age young people at the moment use drugs a lot less than their parents did when they were the same age. That's drugs overall, and if you pick out down here Class A drug use amongst 16 to 24-year-olds, that has also gone down, although the effect is not quite so large. We can pick out some individual drugs, and for cannabis and for ecstasy, there have been declines in use between the 1990s and the early part of the last decade, but then subsequently use of these substances has picked up a bit in young people. That's the top line. Powder cocaine became increasingly popular in the early 2000s, then it declined, and then more recently use of powder cocaine has increased. And that's a particular concern because there are additional dangers around powder cocaine compared to, say, cannabis and ecstasy. I'll come back to those in a little bit more detail in a minute. So does drug misuse matter? Well, one reason it matters is that there are physical harms from drug use. One physical harm is that people may get acute toxicity from the direct effects of the drugs on their bodies. And those effects can sometimes be very severe or even fatal. And we'll talk a little bit more about acute toxic effects in a minute. That is, as a medical doctor working in a hospital, that is what I specialize in. drugs may also cause dependence or addiction. And so it may no longer be a choice for people to use them. They may have to use them because otherwise they develop symptoms of withdrawal. There may be harms from the way drugs are administered. For example, snorting cocaine damages the blood vessels in the nose and can cause necrosis and loss of the nasal septum, as in this picture up here. People who inject drugs may introduce infection, which may be localized, as in this injection sites down here in the second picture, or it may be generalized and cause septicemia or heart infections or lung abscesses, which can be potentially life-threatening. There are also risks from being intoxicated. People's judgment is not as good. They may have accidents. They may behave in ways that otherwise they wouldn't have done, and that can result in, for example, sexually transmitted diseases or unwanted pregnancies. So there are a range of physical risks from drug misuse. They are not necessarily the same risks for all drugs that people might choose to use. This lower picture, by the way, is somebody who has got ischemic fingers and an ischemic hand, i.e. a hand lacking in blood supply and oxygen, following the accidental injection of contaminated drug substance into an artery in the arm. So that would be another indirect effect of the method of administration. Can we quantify any of these adverse health effects? Well, there's a lot of data out there. In England and Wales, for the last year for which data is published, well, we've got just over 18,000 hospital admissions for poisoning associated with drug misuse, and that number has increased recently. If you just were to restrict to people who come to emergency departments, the number would be about 5 times higher, so probably more than 100,000 presentations to emergency departments with effects after drug misuse. We have nearly 3,000 deaths now relating to drug misuse every year in England and Wales. And just over 250,000 people use drug and alcohol services each year. So these are quite big numbers. What's of particular concern is that over the last 30 years or so, mortality from drug misuse has been increasing. You can see the blue line in the middle of this is the whole population and mortality per million people, and it's been going up. The top orange line is men, and men are much more likely to die as a result of drug misuse than women, because drug misuse is more common in men. The grey line at the bottom is women. So this increase is a particular concern. So my next question, my next poll question, we've got the same choices of drugs, but what I want to ask you is which of these 5 drugs do you think is the most, causes the largest numbers of deaths in England and Wales? So I'll give you a few minutes to think about that, or at least a few seconds to think about that and to put your answer down. Okay. So that's very interesting. Not many of you think it's cannabis, and you'd be right about that. MDMA or ecstasy, cocaine and heroin are very evenly distributed. And nitrous oxide, not many of you think that causes a problem. And the cannabis and nitrous oxide people are definitely right. So I'm going to close that now and show you what the answer is. And the answer is it's heroin. This is listed here as heroin and morphine because actually heroin and morphine are very closely related molecules. It's very difficult to tell them apart when one's investigating a death. They cause around about twice as many deaths as cocaine does. MDMA, as you'll see much further down that column, causes a relatively low number of deaths. So in that terms, it's less of a public health issue. So I'm really concerned about heroin, a little also really concerned about cocaine, but perhaps not to the same extent. And then there's a number of other drugs that weren't on that list, like benzodiazepines, like diazepam, temazepam, Xanax, which can cause or contribute to death. Pregabalin is increasingly misused. Tramadol, which is an opiate, a bit like codeine, and new psychoactive substances, about which I'll say more later. These all can cause deaths, and they're all in that mid-range there. I've also on this graph, I've colored these drugs according to their classification. And you can see that while the most dangerous drugs are all class A, there's a bunch of class C's there. And then if you go down to the bottom, there's some more class A's. So you may wonder whether the classification of drugs in terms of danger is actually correct or not. And that is an open debate. We can also look at trends over the last nearly 30 years. And I showed you already that deaths due to drug misuse overall have increased in that time. That top blue line is heroin, effectively. And you can see that deaths have gone up in relation to heroin. It's quite interesting that deaths went up quite a lot in the 1990s, flattened out over the early 2000s, and then increased again around this last decade. One reason why heroin-related deaths flattened out during the early 2000s is because the supply of heroin from the Middle East was compromised by wars that were taking place there. And so the amount of heroin which came to the UK and the concentration of preparations that people were able to get was not as good. And that meant that it was actually safer because there was less heroin in it, there less risk of overdose. The red line is methadone. Methadone is a drug used to treat heroin addiction, but it's also quite widely misused. That thick brown line is benzodiazepines. And then you can see this steady, remorseless rise in this orange line here, which is cocaine, which is currently a particular issue. So I've shown you some numbers for prevalence of use from the crime survey, so we can estimate how many people use each of these drugs. And I've also shown you data about how many people die after using each of these drugs. It's therefore possible to make an estimate of the number of deaths that happen each year per 100,000 people who have used that drug over the last year. And this is what I've done here in this table. And you can see the very large difference in risk of death between heroin at the bottom, 6,000 deaths per 100,000 last year users, and cannabis, just 1 death per 100,000 last year users. Cocaine is somewhere in the middle there with new psychoactive substances. And MDMA or ecstasy causes deaths, but considering the volume of use, those deaths are relatively uncommon. So this is to try to get things into some sort of objective order so that we can think about drugs in terms of their true harms. So here's my third quiz question. And we're now going to talk about geography. I'm here in the northeast of England, but I know that you're coming from other parts of the UK. What I want to know is, after correction for population size, which part of the UK do you think has the highest rate of drug-related deaths? I'd be interested to see what you think about this. So that's very interesting. So you voted London as the hotspot for drug-related deaths in the UK, with Northeast England second, Northwest third, Scotland fourth, and then Wales fifth. In fact, the reality is somewhat different from that. The place in the UK which has the highest drug-related deaths by some considerable margin is Scotland. Scotland has a major public health problem with drug-related death. There are very high rates of heroin use there. There's also very high use of benzodiazepines like diazepam, temazepam, those sorts of compounds. Then the northeast of England, where I am, is the highest rate place in England. Northern Ireland and Wales come next, and then various other English regions. It's interesting looking at that and wondering why Scotland, the northeast, the northwest, Northern Ireland and Wales might be more effective than other parts of the country. It's quite interesting that actually the place with the lowest rate of drug-related death is London. So just think about why that might be for a minute, and I'll move on to the next slide. And it tells you one big factor here is social deprivation. We know that social deprivation is associated with drug use, and particularly problematic use of high-risk drugs like heroin and crack cocaine, which are highly associated with mortality. It's also associated with a lower age of first use, progression to drug dependence, injecting drugs, risky use, health and social complications from use, and also criminal involvement, and a reduced likelihood of care and treatment, and a reduced likelihood of overcoming drug-related problems. So social deprivation cuts through drug misuse. It's a really central factor in all of this, and rates of social deprivation are an important factor in determining local rates of drug-related death. So to underline this, what this graph shows is hospital admission for drug misuse related behavioral disturbances on the dark blue, and for poisoning in the light blue. And it's been divided into deprivation deciles. So to explain that, people in decile 10 are the 10% of the population living in the least deprived areas. And those in decile 1 are people in the most deprived areas. So if we look down here at decile 1, the 10% of the population living in the most deprived areas have a rate of about 30 hospital admissions per 100,000. Those in the least deprived areas have a rate of about 6. So there's a 5-fold difference depending on where you live in terms of deprivation indices. And if you look at poisoning, you see a very similar sort of trend. So social deprivation and drug misuse go together. And if you look at people accessing drug services, they are also generally quite a deprived population. They're most commonly male because drug misuse is much more common in males. There's a very high rate of housing problems and of homelessness. And that's particularly true for opiate users, so heroin users. And there's a very high rate also of mental health need in that population. One of the questions I posed at the beginning was whether drug misuse matters. And of course, it does matter, not just for health terms, but also in societal terms as well. Because drug users, and particularly people who use problem drugs like heroin and cocaine, are more likely to have compromised employment and education. Their drug habit costs money, and so they may fall into financial hardship, particularly as they may no longer be in employment. There are effects on personal relationships, on families, on children. They may become homeless, and they may need to revert to criminal behavior, such as theft, prostitution, drug dealing, and violence, in order to fund their drug habits. There is a particular concern at the moment about a phenomenon called county lines, affecting younger people who are drawn into drug use and then used by organized crime to transport and sell drugs in outside major metropolitan areas, in more rural areas, to expand the markets for drugs so that more profit is made. So exploiting of young people is also quite common in the context of drug misuse. So not all drug users are the same. And on this slide, I've showed you two different broad types, and these are two different stereotypes, and no stereotype is ever completely true. But I just want to make a point. There are people who use drugs, perhaps in the context of festivals. These are often affluent, employed, quite well-educated people who have happy lives, use drugs occasionally, and seek euphoria, which is a good happiness feeling, and empathy, which is a feeling that they're getting on with other people and liking other people and feeling very sociable. And they may use drugs like MDMA or ecstasy, or some of the new psychoactive substances, which may have similar effects. And I'll say a bit more about them later. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there's homeless people who are, of course, poor, unemployed, often undereducated. They live an unpleasant life. They're vulnerable and afraid. They're often regular and long-term drug users. They're commonly drug dependent. And one of the drivers for them to use drugs is to avoid withdrawal because of their addiction, but also for mind-numbing effects, to just try and knock themselves out because their circumstances are so unpleasant, particularly overnight. And so they're likely to use sedative drugs, heroin in particular, and also synthetic cannabis substitutes, the so-called synthetic cannabinoids, an example of a new psychoactive substance. So I want now just to talk about 4 specific drug problems. First of all, well, I'm going to talk about cannabis. I'm going to talk about cannabis, ecstasy, heroin, and new psychoactive substances. So first of all, cannabis. Cannabis is a natural herbal substance. It comes from this plant, Cannabis sativa. The plant contains many active ingredients, but its principal psychoactive component is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. Now, the plant contains THC in different concentrations in different parts of the plant. And if you cultivate the plant intensively, you can get plants which have very high THC content. Cannabis, as you know, is used generally by smoking or by eating, ingestion. There are some other ways of using it. THC products, for example, can be vaped using e-cigarettes. Toxicity of cannabis is quite low. It doesn't tend to cause life-threatening poisoning by itself. There's increasing medical use of cannabis, and cannabis-based medicinal products are now no longer illegal for use in the UK, and they're becoming easier to use for certain indications. Cannabis itself, herbal cannabis, is still illegal in the UK. It's a Class B drug of misuse, but it is legal in some countries and in some states in the United States. And so there's interesting experience developing there. One of the concerns about cannabis are the effects of long-term use, and particularly long-term heavy use. This may be associated with lung damage and increased infections, especially lung infections, which are probably an effect of inhaling smoke. There's an increased risk of cancer affecting the head and neck. Also of concern, people who are heavy cannabis users have a higher risk of psychosis or schizophrenia, particularly if they're regular users using cannabis every day, using high concentration cannabis products, smoking for a long time. And there's some evidence that cannabis users have memory impairment, although these things are quite difficult to sort out from other causes that may also be present in people who use drugs. A few words about ecstasy. Ecstasy, or MDMA, methylene dioxymethamphetamine. Well, as you can see from the name, it's an amphetamine-related compound. It causes euphoric and empathic effects, as I explained before. Severe toxicity is unusual, and we've discussed already what the mortality is in the context of the number of people who use ecstasy, but it does happen. And what's disarming about it is it's can be very unpredictable, so that people who have used ecstasy and not had a bad experience with it, maybe they've enjoyed the effect of ecstasy on a number of occasions before, can use what's apparently the same dose and then suddenly have unpleasant effects and sometimes even life-threatening effects. That's not common. I'm not going to exaggerate how often this happens, but it does happen sometimes. And you will see, if you want to look at the internet, you can find plenty of examples of people who've come to harm from ecstasy use. Why is it that people get these effects of high temperature and failure of multiple organ systems? The answer is we don't really know. That's one of the reasons why it's so unpredictable. Maybe there are genetic factors. Maybe there may be other substances present in the ecstasy preparation that people think they're buying. Ecstasy tablets contain a whole range of different psychoactive substances and drugs, depending on what dealers have to package in them. And another issue which is of concern is that the amount of MDMA in ecstasy tablets has often been surprisingly high. And the larger the dose you take, the more likely you are to have severe adverse effects. And one problem with an uncontrolled drug market is you don't quite know what you're getting and what dose you're getting. So now I want to turn on to heroin, which is important because of the numbers of drug-related deaths associated with it. So heroin, its chemical name is diacetyl morphine or diamorphine. It's closely related to the painkiller morphine. It's derived from the opium poppy. You can see there in the top panel. It's usually smoked over foil, or it's injected. Heroin stimulates so-called opioid receptors, which are present in the central nervous system. And that results in the effects that are being looked for, which is euphoria and relaxation, drowsiness. In higher dose or in early users, it can cause vomiting, and high doses cause unconsciousness and can stop your breathing. And this is called heroin overdose. And that is quite likely to be fatal if the dose is high enough. Another factor which is really important is that heroin is highly addictive. So after just a few uses, the user will develop symptoms. If they don't then have further doses, they will develop unpleasant symptoms. And so they need further heroin to keep those symptoms away. And the whole problem is self-perpetuating and worsening. The heroin that we use in the UK comes almost exclusively from Afghanistan, and it is smuggled in across the Middle East and Eastern Europe into the UK. So I showed you before how the political situation and wars in the Middle East impaired the supply of heroin in them in the early 2000s. And that resulted in reduced heroin-related deaths in the UK. The situation is more normalized now, and heroin-related deaths are increasing again. So how can we save lives from heroin overdose? Well, one way is to prevent supply, and that's a law enforcement, a border control issue to try and stop heroin coming to the UK, to try and stop and discourage people from supplying it. But from a medical point of view, we can treat and prevent acute overdose. So there is treatment for acute overdose. There's an antidote or antagonist called naloxone, which blocks the opiate receptors, which mediate the toxic effects of heroin. And actually, it's one of the most remarkable things in medicine is to watch somebody who is intoxicated with heroin recover within seconds when naloxone is administered. The problem is that when people overdose, there aren't people around them who have access to naloxone. So to try and circumvent this, heroin users may be given packs of naloxone to carry on their person, with a view to people that they know, their families, people that they mix with, being trained how to use naloxone should that person overdose. And take-home naloxone can save lives. It's a question of making it as available as possible, and that has been a struggle in the UK up to now. Another idea is to have drug consumption clinics where heroin users can go to inject, where there would be people around and naloxone around if they overdose. Drug consumption clinics are not really accepted in England and Wales, where the political view is that that might be seen as encouraging drug use, which politicians don't want to do. But where they have been trialled, drug consumption clinics have reduced mortality in heroin users. And so there is still a debate going on about them. And of course, heroin users are addicted, and so provision of drugs treatment services to treat addiction can reduce the risk of injection of heroin and therefore the risk of overdose. So one form of treatment is called opioid substitution therapy, or OST, which prevents withdrawal. And so drugs like methadone and buprenorphine and even heroin can be prescribed. That means that the heroin user no longer needs to use heroin to prevent withdrawal features. And opioid substitution therapy can be very effective for that. And it may be taken in the long term. Sometimes people may wean off it and therefore no longer become addicts, but it's more common perhaps for people to stay on opioid substitution therapy over a number of years. And that just reduces the risk that they'll need to use heroin. There are other treatments which block the pleasurable effects of heroin, which can be suitable for some heroin users. And then preventing and treating infections by providing clean needles, providing foil to encourage smoking rather than injecting, because injecting is much more hazardous. And there's the much wider issue of tackling the societal issues, the health inequality, the homelessness, which might encourage or underlie heroin use. That's a more difficult thing to deal with. The last slide I want to show you on heroin is related to these compounds called fentanyls. And this is a big concern at the moment around the world. Fentanyl is also an opioid drug, but fentanyl itself is 100 times more potent than heroin. And there are fentanyl analogues or related compounds that are substantially more potent even than that. Fentanyl can be manufactured synthetically, and the addition of synthetic fentanyl to heroin product has become a problem in some parts of the world, notably in North America, where it's increasingly used to fortify the heroin supply. And the problem with that is that dealers may not put in the right amount. It's very easy for them to put in too much fentanyl into the supply, and so suddenly somebody has an extremely potent product to inject. When they do inject it, overdose may become inevitable and death is very likely. So this graph shows you the increasing amount of number of people who have fentanyl in their blood when they have died after apparent heroin overdose in Canada. And in fact, those numbers have gone up since 2016. This is also the case in many parts of the United States. It isn't an issue here in the UK at the moment, but it's something that we need to monitor. So now I want to say something about new psychoactive substances. This is the last major topic I'm going to cover. New psychoactive substances, or NPS, are substances which are chemically quite closely related to traditional illegal drugs. They just differ slightly chemically, and that difference means that they're no longer captured by drug control legislation, because drug control legislation defines drugs according to their chemical structure largely. So there are synthetic chemists, notably in China, who look at the laws about drugs around the world and produce highly pure examples of compounds which are closely chemically related to illegal drugs, but which circumvent legislation and then can be exported and sold much more easily than illegal drugs. There are very many examples of these compounds. So I'd just like to show you this example. This was the first one that caused a major public health problem in the UK. This was in 2010, so 10 years ago. The compound you're looking at here is called methamphetamine or crystal meth. This is a traditional, old-style, controlled, illegal drug. This is a drug that was manufactured in Breaking Bad. Part of that series depends on the manufacture of crystal meth within the United States. And that was a clever thing to do, to find better ways of synthesizing methamphetamine. But an even cleverer thing to do is to change the structure of the molecule so that you have something which is no longer illegal. So if I flip the slide, just by adding these two little groups there to methamphetamine, you get a different compound called mephedrone. And mephedrone, or meow meow, or MCAT, in 2010 was not illegal. And in fact, in the UK, you could buy it in a shop or a petrol station. And it was, in terms of its effects, very similar to the effects of crystal meth. Mephedrone, of course, was controlled then, but the problem is that you then produce further drugs which differ slightly more. And the numbers of drugs you can produce is almost unlimited. So I don't want to go through this table in detail, but if you look at the conventional examples of drugs, there are MPS examples for all of them. And in fact, there are very many more MPS examples that are listed on this slide. So almost anything you can make a slight modification to produce an MPS that is no longer controlled. And so that presents a real problem for governments around the world who are trying to keep people safe by making potentially hazardous chemicals illegal. This slide shows the numbers of NPS, individual compounds notified in the European Union over the last 10 or 12 years. And you can see that each year, quite a large number of different compounds are found in the European Union, peaking in 2014 when there were over 100 separate new compounds identified. The numbers have fallen off a little bit since then, but they're still over 50 per year. So this is still quite a big deal. And it's quite a problem for the medical profession because people come in having used compounds about which there's no experience, and we simply don't know much about them. We don't know what effects we might expect and what the best treatment might be. It's a problem for governments as well. This is the whack-a-mole phenomenon where you control one drug, but then 3 or 4 others that are quite similar that you haven't controlled pop up instead. And so that's quite a problem. So to deal with this in the UK, the government introduced something called the Psychoactive Substances Act in 2016. What this does is say that supply of anything which is psychoactive, i.e. a chemical which acts on the brain, is illegal. There were exemptions, so substances already controlled by the Misuse of Drugs Act, but also nicotine, alcohol, caffeine, and medicines are exempt. And then there are offences for production or supply of these compounds. Possession of MPS is not an offence in the UK unless you happen to be in prison at the time, in which case it is. So the Psychoactive Substances Act banned these compounds. Did that work? Well, this is a study that we've been doing here in Newcastle University, and we've been measuring what drugs are present in the blood and urine samples of people attending emergency departments after with apparent drug toxicity. And you can see that since 2016, there's been quite a fall in the blue line, which are people where we find an NPS in their blood, whereas the conventional drugs have remained present in a high proportion of these patients. So perhaps the Psychoactive Substances Act has had some impact in improving public health. We can look at individual compounds, and this top line are called SCRAs, the synthetic cannabinoids. They've been the most common MPS that we've seen in the UK. And their prevalence have fallen off considerably. And the same is true for cathinones, of which mephedrone I was just talking about as an example, and also of these rather nasty hallucinogens called embomy compounds. They've all become less common since the Psychoactive Substances Act came into force. Deaths involving MPS well, they seem to fall after the Psychoactive Substances Act, but they've gone up again. So I'm not sure that we have solved that problem as yet. So I've got my last quiz question now. So having heard what I've had to say, I'd like to ask you whether you think MDMA or ecstasy should be legal to possess and supply, or should be legal to possess but illegal to supply, i.e. you can keep it yourself but not sell it to somebody else, or should be illegal to possess and illegal to supply. So I'd be interested in your opinions. There isn't a right or wrong answer to this question. This is a matter of opinion, and politicians, doctors, social scientists have been debating these sorts of issues for years. So I'd be very interested to see what your opinion is about this. Good. Well, that's very interesting. So very few of you think we should fully legalize MDMA, only 4%. 38% of you think it should be legal to possess but illegal to supply. And 58% of you are sticking with the current situation, which is that MDMA is illegal to possess and illegal to supply. So that's quite interesting. And it probably reflects the views across a much larger population of people. So that's what I want to say to you. I've got my summary up here. I'm not going to read it out, but maybe I'll just leave that there for a moment. And I'm looking forward to hearing and answering some questions from you. And I hope that you found that of some interest. Thanks very much for listening to me.
Hi, Simon. Thank you so much. That was such an interesting talk, and really good to have that much information given to people that they can, make their own judgments from. So fantastic. And we've had a lot of questions. So I'm going to pull up a few. And one of the main themes that we've had is asking for your opinion on the legalization of drugs.
So do I think drugs should be legalized? I have to say, I don't think that they should. My view is that governments have a responsibility to their populations to ensure that substances that are particularly hazardous are not easily available. Our experience when methadone was legal was we saw a massive spike in use and a massive spike in adverse health effects. And I think making drugs legal, people think that they must be safe. People often say it's legal, it must be safe. And the corollary of that, I guess, is that to persuade people that you think things are illegal, to persuade people that you think that they're unsafe, you have to make access difficult. So I think that there has to be legal control. I don't think that there's a great drive to try to penalize drug users. It's the supply chain, I think, where most of the concentration should go.
Thank you. And how do you identify what class a drug is in?
Well, it's a matter of opinion what class a drug should be in, but legally, the government have a council of experts who look at drugs and provide advice to the government. But in the end, the government decide what the final outcome is. So, for example, about 10 years ago, the government asked their advisory council to look at cannabis again, about where cannabis should be classified. The advisory council said, well, it's currently in class B, but we don't think it's as dangerous as that. We think it should move down to class C. They published that advice, but the government said, no, we're going to keep it in class B because we don't want to be seen to be endorsing drug use in any way. So there are political as well. You may have noticed in that talk that MDMA is in class A amongst the most dangerous drugs, but the evidence doesn't suggest that MDMA is as dangerous as other drugs in that category. And so there is an argument for moving that down. But again, there's quite a lot of political resistance to doing that because MDMA is so widely used and they don't want to give the signal that maybe MDMA is safer than it actually is. So these are quite difficult societal issues.
Very much so, thank you. And a lot of questions coming in asking why alcohol isn't classed as being in the drug system.
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting question, which is cultural. We've used alcohol as a recreational substance for millennia in this country and around the world. It's part of our culture, and that's the reason that governments have not made alcohol illegal. There was a social experiment, as you may know, in the United States post-World War I of prohibition of making alcohol illegal. Actually, it didn't really work. It generated a massive criminal industry to sell alcohol at higher prices to the population who were prepared to buy it. That was a problem in controlling alcohol. You could use the same argument about cannabis or other recreational drugs and say, actually, if you made them legal, then you would take the legs away from the whole criminal industry around them. And there are valid arguments there, but you have to weigh those up against the potential harms of much wider spread population use of these substances. So that's why alcohol's not illegal. It's really cultural, but it is certainly a major public health problem. I wouldn't want to say anything otherwise.
Thank you.
By the way.
And also, so this is quite a personal question for you. Somebody is asking what it's like treating patients who have overdosed on drugs.
It's just like any other illness, as far as I'm concerned. We treat people every day who have toxic effects from drugs. Sometimes it's drug misuse, sometimes it's in the context of self-harm. These things are very common. We'll see several patients like that every day in our hospital. Our job as doctors and physicians is to try to find out what's wrong with people without making judgments about them, treat them, get them better, and then provide them with information so that they can make decisions in the future. I don't tell people that they shouldn't. I don't order people not to take drugs, but I give them reasons as to why they may not be the sensible thing for them to be doing. But in the end, people are going to make their own decisions. And it's important that things I say to them, they see as being balanced. And that's what I've tried to do in this talk today as well.
Thank you. Right, we'll get a couple more in. There's a question here asking how exactly is one drug considered to be more addictive than another?
So again, that's a good question, and it's not easy to quantify these things. Some drugs that we use are almost not addictive. So cannabis, for example, MDMA, it's very unusual that people are driven to use these because they develop physical symptoms when they don't use them. But up the scale, heroin is clearly very highly addictive, and cocaine is also much more addictive than say MDMA is. You can look at the pattern of use, but there isn't a kind of easy answer as to how you measure addictiveness. But it's very clear that some drugs are more addictive than others.
Thank you. And I think we'll make this the last question. The question is, how did Simon decide that he wanted to specialise in this?
So I wanted to be a physician. I was always interested in medicines and using medicines. And in fact, I went into clinical pharmacology, which is the study of medicines. But I realized, training in clinical pharmacology, that the biggest health impacts involving pharmacology were actually in poisoning and toxicology. So I became a specialist in poisoning, and I have treated people with different types of poisoning, be it drugs, be it natural substances, snake bite. I gave advice today about scorpion sting, unusually, for somebody in Kenya. But these things are relatively unusual, these exotic things, whereas drug misuse is common. And so we spend a lot of time looking after people who misuse drugs. And actually, we can do a lot for them in terms of treatment and education. And it's a group of people who are poisoned people of all types, of people who are often relatively young. And if you can save them, they have many, many years of normal life ahead of them. So they are a group worth investing in. I like treating this group. I like treating young people, and some of them can be quite challenging. Some drug users can be quite challenging, aggressive, sometimes even violent. I don't mind that too much. I find them a very stimulating group of people to be involved with.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent place to end, a really positive end. Thank you so much, Simon, for such an interesting talk.